I remember the day clearly, though it feels like it happened in another life. The kind of day when the sun is shining but everything inside you feels gray and heavy. My parents had always been proud, but somehow their pride had a name that was not mine. My younger brother, Rafi, was the golden child, the one everyone praised, the one whose achievements filled our home with compliments and admiration, while I quietly existed in the background, unseen and unheard. I had tried, of course, I always tried. I studied late at night while Rafi went out with friends. I worked hard, helping around the house, excelling in school, saving every small accomplishment in my heart, hoping that one day they would notice me. But they never did, not the way they noticed him. I remember one afternoon, walking into the living room after finishing a scholarship project, holding the letter in my trembling hands, hoping to share my success with them. My mother was in the kitchen, humming softly, and my father was on the sofa, reading the newspaper. I cleared my throat and said softly, "Mom, Dad, I got accepted to the scholarship program." My father glanced up, barely lifting his eyes from the pages, and said, "That's nice. How about Rafi? Did he finish his project?" Their focus immediately shifted to him, and for a moment, the words I had just spoken felt like they had never existed. I smiled politely, my heart sinking quietly, and said, "Yes, but this one is mine." They nodded, almost absent-mindedly, and returned to their own conversation. I walked out of the room slowly, holding back the hurt. That moment was not a shout, not a fight, just quiet dismissal, but it left a mark deeper than any words could. From that day on, I began noticing the small ways I was replaced in their attention. My achievements were never celebrated. My thoughts were often interrupted by discussions about Rafi. Every conversation seemed to circle back to him, and I learned to speak softly, to make myself small, to avoid drawing attention, because every time I tried, it felt like I was competing with an invisible weight I could never lift. Over time, I developed a quiet habit of observation. I watched my parents' pride light up for him, the way they talked to him, the way they laughed at his jokes, the way they seemed to expect more from me simply because I was older but never celebrated my efforts. I began to retreat into my own world, finding comfort in the small things I could control, my studies, my friendships, my work. I reminded myself that one day, my abilities would speak louder than their favoritism. That day came quietly, though I did not know it yet. My parents, in their pride, started helping Rafi with his small business, investing in ideas that were half-formed but seemed shiny because they were his. I, on the other hand, worked a full-time job, sending small amounts of money home, covering my own bills, learning patience and strategy in silence. The tension in our family was subtle but ever-present. My brother's confidence, my parents' expectations, my quiet resentment that I never voiced. One rainy afternoon, as I was reviewing the small business reports Rafi had asked me to check for a friend, I realized that he was struggling more than anyone realized. My parents were too proud to see it. They assumed he could do no wrong. I spent hours going over the numbers, making notes, suggesting small corrections. I sent him a carefully written email, hoping to help, not to take credit. A few days later, my father called me to the house. His voice was calm but carried a tension I had not heard before. "Rafi's business, it's in trouble," he said quietly. I nodded, already anticipating what would be asked of me. "We need you to look at the contracts. Your signature is required for the bank to continue the loan." My heart sank in a way I did not expect. The very system that had ignored my efforts, that had replaced me in their hearts with Rafi, was now calling on me to save him. I swallowed the quiet pain and agreed. That night, I sat at my small kitchen table with the papers spread in front of me. The rain tapped gently against the window, the only sound in the room aside from my soft sighs. I reviewed every detail meticulously, checking numbers, contracts, and signatures. I thought about all the years I had been invisible, all the times I had been passed over, all the quiet sacrifices I had made. And I realized that none of that mattered to me in this moment. Not the hurt, not the favoritism, not the long shadows of neglect. What mattered was the quiet power I had built through patience, skill, and persistence. I signed the documents, knowing that my careful attention would save the business. I did not boast. I did not call attention to my work. I simply did what needed to be done. The next morning, my parents were waiting for me in the living room. They looked anxious, a rare flicker of worry on their faces. "Rafi," my mother began softly, he says everything is fine now." My father nodded slowly. "Thanks to you, of course." I smiled gently, letting the words pass over me. "I just did what was necessary," I said quietly. They did not realize it, but in that moment the invisible child in the family, the one replaced, overlooked, and undervalued, had quietly proven his worth. My brother, Rafi, came running into the room soon after, unaware of the quiet realization unfolding around him. He hugged our parents, laughing and thanking them for helping him. I stayed back, watching, smiling softly. I could see the relief on their faces, the gratitude they felt, yet they still had no idea who had really made it possible. And in that gentle, quiet moment, I understood something important: that recognition from those who replace or ignore you is not necessary to measure your worth. True value is shown in what you do, not in who applauds you. I walked to my room that evening, feeling a calm warmth inside, a quiet satisfaction that did not need anyone's approval. The rain had stopped and the first stars were peeking through the clouds. I realized that life sometimes asks us to rise quietly, to prove our worth in silence, and to show that even when replaced, forgotten, or overlooked, our abilities, patience, and integrity remain unshaken. That night, as I sat by the window watching the city lights reflect on wet streets, I whispered softly to myself, I may have been invisible to them, but I am never invisible to life. And one day, my quiet strength will speak louder than their favoritism. And with that gentle thought, I felt a calmness, a quiet hope, and the beginning of a story that was about to unfold in ways my parents could never have expected. The days that followed saving Rafi's business were quiet, almost surreal. My parents went about their routines, unaware of the weight I had carried in my hands, the hours I had spent reviewing contracts, making sure every detail was perfect. They praised Rafi again, talking about how fortunate he was to have such good support, and I smiled softly, letting them continue their belief without interruption. It would have been easy to feel bitter, to demand recognition, to confront the years of favoritism and neglect. But I didn't. Instead, I quietly reflected on the patterns I had learned over the years, how patience, careful planning, and silent perseverance always outlast pride and ignorance. I noticed how my brother, who had always been confident, almost cocky, now looked tired and uncertain, asking small questions he used to ignore. For the first time, I realized that the so-called golden child was not invincible. Rafi had been given privileges, opportunities, and applause, but he lacked the foundation I had quietly built for years: the discipline, the understanding of consequences, the careful attention to detail. I felt a quiet satisfaction, not from seeing him struggle, but from knowing that my efforts had always mattered, even when no one recognized them. In the evenings, I would sit alone in my room with a cup of tea, thinking about all the times I had been overlooked. I remembered my first day in high school, when my parents praised Rafi for winning a small art contest, while my own awards were barely mentioned. I remembered every quiet compliment I had given him, every time I stayed up late to help him with homework, every sacrifice I made without expecting thanks. And now, ironically, the very work I had quietly done for the family was the one thing keeping his dreams alive. I wondered if my parents would ever notice. I doubted it, but I also knew that their perception did not define my worth. That thought became a quiet shield, a gentle comfort, letting me carry the weight of responsibility without resentment. One afternoon, Rafi approached me with a stack of papers, looking nervous. Arif, I think I made a mistake here, he said, his voice soft, almost hesitant. I looked at him calmly, taking the papers from his hands and began reviewing them. I did not scold. I did not remind him of his mistakes. I simply corrected, explained, and guided. He watched me silently, probably realizing for the first time how capable I had always been. My parents walked in midway, curious about our conversation. They noticed my focus, my attention to detail, but did not speak. They assumed I was helping as usual. They had no idea that the business, their golden child's future, depended on the quiet work I had done behind the scenes. And perhaps it was better that way. I wanted the results, not the applause. I wanted the satisfaction of knowing I had kept my integrity intact, even when others failed to see it. Weeks passed, and the company's small recovery became visible. Clients expressed satisfaction, employees began to trust Rafi again, and even my parents started to show subtle relief. Yet still, they gave the credit to Rafi. They had no idea that the golden child's safety net had always been me. One evening, I was in my room when my mother knocked softly. She came in, carrying a cup of tea. She sat beside me and said quietly, "You've been very patient, Arif. Thank you for always helping Rafi." I looked at her, surprised. Her words were gentle, almost apologetic. I nodded softly, feeling a warmth rise in my chest. "I just do what needs to be done," I said calmly. She smiled, and for a moment the silence between us was comforting, healing in a way I had not expected. It was the first time she had acknowledged my quiet efforts without comparing them to my brother's. That small acknowledgement felt like a victory of its own. Later that night, Rafi came to my room again. He was quiet, almost reflective. "Arif, I never realized how much you did for me," he said softly. I looked at him, and instead of gloating or feeling resentment, I felt a gentle empathy. "I've always been here," I said simply. "It's not about being noticed. It's about doing what's right." His expression softened, a mixture of guilt and relief crossing his face. He finally understood, in a quiet, personal way, what patience and diligence truly meant. Over the following months, I continued to guide the business subtly, making sure every decision was sound, every contract safe, every choice informed. My parents still treated Rafi as the golden child, still praised him openly, still assumed the credit belonged to him. But I no longer felt invisible. I understood a simple truth. Recognition is temporary, perception is fragile, but competence, patience, and quiet integrity are lasting. One rainy evening, I sat by the window, watching the streets glisten in the streetlights, reflecting on how things had shifted without anyone noticing. I had once felt replaced, ignored, and undervalued. I had once believed that their favoritism defined my worth, but now I knew that my quiet strength, my persistence, and my careful attention to detail were what kept everything afloat. I had been invisible, yes, but I had also been indispensable. That realization filled me with a gentle pride, not loud or demanding, but calm and steady. I understood that the humiliation of being replaced had given me perspective, empathy, and resilience. I could forgive without forgetting. I could continue without resentment. And I could guide without seeking applause. The small victories, the moments Rafi realized my help mattered, the subtle relief on my parents' faces, the company beginning to stabilize were enough. They did not need to be loud. They did not need to be recognized by the world. I carried them quietly in my heart. That night, as I closed my eyes, I whispered softly to myself, I may have been replaced, but I am never powerless. My patience, my work, and my integrity are mine alone. And one day, even those who overlooked me will see what I always knew, that quiet strength cannot be ignored forever. And in that quiet reflection, I felt hope. Hope for the family, hope for my brother, and hope for myself. A hope that the next chapter would not be about being replaced, but about being quietly, undeniably recognized for the value I had always carried. It all came to a head one late afternoon, the kind of day when the sun drifts slowly behind clouds, casting a soft, almost melancholy light across everything. I was in my small home office, reviewing some of the contracts for Rafi's business when my father walked in. His expression was quiet but tense, unlike his usual calm demeanor. Arif, he said softly, we need your signature on a new loan agreement. Without it, the company can't continue. I paused, looking at him, then down at the papers in my hands. For years, I had been overlooked, replaced, and dismissed, but now they were coming to me in the quietest, most necessary way, asking me to save what they had assumed would succeed on its own. I felt a strange calm settle over me. This was not about pride. This was not about revenge. This was about the quiet power of patience, knowledge, and diligence finally being recognized, even if no one would openly admit it. I signed the papers carefully, making sure every clause, every number, every requirement was in order. Rafi watched silently, perhaps realizing for the first time how much this moment depended on me. My parents hovered near the doorway, hesitant, unsure if they should interfere or just let me do what I had been doing so quietly for years. And in that quiet room, I realized something profound. Their perception of me had always been wrong, but that did not matter anymore. What mattered was that I had built the foundation for everything to survive, even when no one noticed. A few days later, the loan was approved and the business began to stabilize. My parents came to me again, this time with hesitant words of thanks. Arif, my mother whispered, we didn't realize how much this depended on you. I smiled softly, gently nodding. I've always done what's necessary, I said quietly. My father looked down, the weight of pride and guilt in his eyes. We should have noticed sooner. And that was enough. I did not need apologies. I did not need recognition. I only needed them to understand, even a little, that my quiet efforts had always mattered. Rafi, for his part, began to approach me differently. The arrogance that had once made him careless faded, replaced by a subtle humility. He started asking questions, seeking advice, and for the first time, listening carefully to what I had to say. I guided him, corrected mistakes gently, and let him learn. I did not gloat. I did not remind him of how much he had depended on me. I let the truth speak for itself, quietly, without words. One evening, my father and I were alone in the living room. He sat across from me, hands clasped, and said softly, Arifa, I always assumed Rafi would manage everything. I didn't see what you were doing all these years. I nodded slowly, letting the words settle. It wasn't about being seen, I said calmly. It was about doing what was right. That is what matters. He looked at me with a mixture of admiration and regret, and for the first time I saw him truly understand that their golden child had not been the only one capable. The realization did not come with anger or shouting, only with quiet acknowledgement. And perhaps that was the most powerful way to be recognized. Over the next few weeks, subtle changes occurred. Rafi stopped boasting about achievements as if they were effortless. My parents began to include me in decisions they had always assumed were his domain. I noticed the respect in their eyes, a quiet, steady respect that did not require loud words or grand gestures. The business thrived, and I continued to guide it carefully, always keeping the lessons of invisibility in mind. I knew the value of patience, humility, and quiet diligence. And in the background, I watched my brother learn the same lesson, not through humiliation or confrontation, but through the gentle, undeniable proof of my abilities. One rainy afternoon, I sat by the window, watching the drops run down the glass. Rafi came in and said softly, "Arif, I never understood how much you did for me." I looked at him, not with pride, not with anger, but with gentle understanding. "It's not about recognition," I said quietly. "It's about responsibility, care, and doing what's right. That is how we build something that lasts." He nodded, a soft smile crossing his face, and for the first time our relationship felt balanced. He no longer saw me as someone to overlook or compete with. He saw me as a partner, as an equal, as someone whose quiet strength had always been there, steady and unwavering. My parents, too, began to notice the subtle changes in him. The golden child they had praised for years was now learning the value of patience, listening, and humility, lessons they had never thought to teach him because they assumed he would always succeed effortlessly. I watched silently, feeling calm, satisfied, and quietly proud, not for myself, but for the growth of the people I had always cared about. And in that quiet observation, I realized something crucial. Revenge, anger, and resentment never teach lessons. Only patience, integrity, and quiet action have the power to change hearts, minds, and circumstances. The day they came to me, expecting a signature, was not a moment of triumph or revenge. It was a moment of gentle revelation, a quiet twist of fate where the overlooked child became the one indispensable to their world. That night, as I sat alone, reflecting on the events, I realized how much had changed. Not just in the business, but in the family, in relationships, in the understanding of worth. I whispered softly to myself, "I may have been replaced, invisible, and overlooked, but quiet strength and patience always have their way of being seen. Recognition is not always loud, but it is inevitable for those who persevere." The rain had stopped, and the sky cleared, leaving a calm, soft light in its place. I knew that life had shifted, subtly but completely, and that the quiet lessons I had learned in invisibility would continue to guide me, my brother, and even my parents toward a better understanding of what truly matters: integrity, diligence, and the gentle power of being steady, reliable, and indispensable, even when unnoticed. And in that calm, quiet reflection, I finally felt the story of being replaced come full circle, not with anger or humiliation, but with quiet victory, understanding, and hope for the future. It happened quietly, almost without fanfare, the way some of life's most important lessons arrive. Weeks after I had signed the contracts and stabilized Rafi's business, my parents invited me to the living room one evening. Their faces carried a mix of hesitation and curiosity, as if they were unsure whether this moment would be the one to finally bridge the gap between what they had assumed and what was true. I walked in slowly, my calm presence filling the space they had once reserved only for their golden child. They sat down, my father's hands clasped, my mother's eyes softening as they looked at me, and for a moment no one spoke. Then my mother began, her voice gentle and slightly trembling, "Arif, we have never really seen you the way we should have." I nodded quietly, feeling a warmth rise in my chest, but I did not speak. I let her words settle in the room like sunlight filtering through clouds. My father's voice joined hers, low and filled with reflection. "We always assumed Rafi could manage everything, and we didn't realize how much you've done behind the scenes." I smiled softly, a quiet, heartfelt smile not from triumph, but from the relief of finally being understood. "I've never needed recognition," I said gently. "I just do what is necessary. That is how life keeps moving, and that is how we help those we love." Their expressions shifted subtly, surprise, humility, and slowly admiration. I could see it in the way they leaned forward, the softness in their voices, the quiet acknowledgement that had been absent for years. Rafi, who had been sitting quietly nearby, looked at me with wide eyes. He had always relied on his parents' praise, but now he was learning to see beyond it. "Arif, I never realized," he said softly, his voice low, almost fragile. I placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It's all right," I said calmly. "Now you know, what matters is learning from it, not dwelling on the past." He nodded, swallowing the quiet guilt and relief he felt. Over the next few days, subtle changes filled the house. My parents began including me in decisions they once assumed were Rafi's domain. They asked for my opinions, valued my perspective, and quietly admitted when I had saved the day. Rafi, too, approached me differently. The arrogance that had once made him careless faded, replaced by respect and curiosity. He sought my guidance, listened carefully, and even thanked me privately for all the support he had unknowingly received over the years. I continued to guide the business quietly, ensuring that every choice was sound and every decision thoughtful. My work was never about recognition. It was about responsibility, integrity, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I could make a difference without needing applause. And slowly, the family began to notice not just the results, but the steadiness, the patience, and the quiet strength that had always been a part of who I was. One evening, I found myself alone in my office, looking out at the city lights reflecting on the wet streets after a gentle rain. I thought about all the years I had spent feeling invisible, replaced, and overlooked. I thought about the countless moments I had silently persevered, without thanks, without acknowledgement, without reward. And I realized that all those moments had built something stronger than recognition. They had built character, resilience, and an unshakable sense of self-worth. The past hurt no longer felt heavy. It had softened into quiet strength, the kind that does not need validation from anyone else. Later that night, Rafi came in, carrying a cup of tea. He sat beside me, hesitating, then said softly, "Arifa, I see it now. I see everything you've done. I never understood before, but I do now." I placed my hand gently on his. "It's okay," I said calmly. "What matters is that we move forward, learning and growing. That is what life asks of us." He nodded, a quiet understanding in his eyes. My parents, too, began to approach me with gentleness, curiosity, and respect. They no longer compared me to Rafi or measured me by past expectations. Instead, they began to see me as I had always been, capable, diligent, patient, and quietly strong. And in that gentle acknowledgement, I felt a deep sense of peace. It was not the loud triumphs, the dramatic confrontations, or the words of revenge that mattered. It was the subtle, undeniable proof of consistent effort, integrity, and patience that had reshaped the family's understanding. Days turned into weeks, and the business continued to thrive under our careful guidance. Rafi grew more competent, more responsible, and more aware of what true dedication meant. My parents, too, seemed lighter, relieved to finally recognize the contributions of the child they had once overlooked. One quiet evening, as I sat by the window reflecting on the journey, I whispered softly to myself, "Life has a way of teaching the lessons we need, not always in the way we expect, but in the way that ensures growth, understanding, and quiet victory." I realized that humiliation, being replaced, and feeling invisible had been painful, yes, but they had also been necessary. They had forced me to develop patience, resilience, and empathy. They had prepared me for the moment when my quiet strength would finally matter, not for recognition, but for its own worth. And in that moment, I understood the most important lesson of all, that true power, influence, and value are not measured by applause, praise, or favoritism, but by quiet diligence, integrity, and the courage to persevere when no one is watching. That night, the house felt different. The tension that had once filled the rooms with silent judgment and unspoken comparisons had softened into warmth, respect, and understanding. My parents, my brother, and I sat together quietly, sharing small stories, laughter, and moments of reflection. I realized that the story of being replaced had ended not with revenge or confrontation, but with patience, quiet strength, and gentle revelation. And in that calm, heartfelt conclusion, I felt a sense of fulfillment I had never known before, proof that even when overlooked, underestimated, or replaced, a steady heart and diligent hands will always find their way to make a difference. And eventually, everyone will see the truth in their own time. The golden child had learned humility, the parents had learned perception, and I had learned the quiet satisfaction of being seen, not for my ego, but for the integrity of my work and the love I carried quietly all along. And as I looked at the soft glow of the city lights outside, I whispered once more, "Even when replaced, invisible, or underestimated, patience, strength, and quiet perseverance will always be recognized in the end. And that is more powerful than any applause could ever be."